Yeah, okay, so basically, this is going to be an updated talk from last time. It's basically, I was thinking through what I can do with my current understanding and the time I had to kind of like contribute to kind of the education, the learning. And I came up with this idea of a one-pager essentially, which is essentially supposed to be at some point also this animation of going through end-to-end of a Stack proof. So I called it the life cycle of a Stack proof. Keep in mind, there might still be some of the errors. I just finished it last night, but overall it should be more or less correct. I hope you can see it. If you can't see it, let me know. Okay, so if we talk about the lifecycle Stack proof, we start with the execution trace, we go through some encoding, we apply constraints, and at the very end we apply fry with a commit and verify kind of process. Some prerequisites here. This is a bit small, so I can definitely zoom in. This is not supposed to be presented necessarily. This is supposed to be actually read by every individual. So if we go through the execution trace, maybe I can actually zoom in like this. I just took some prerequisites where I took a fairly small finite field, and I took the h root of unity, which is just a few things that are needed to kind of just start computing this. And then we just take this execution trace. So I basically broke it down into 12 steps. So in the end, it will be 12 steps. Okay, so the whole idea is that we have a binary file, we execute it, and we essentially record execution trace, which in this case here, over clock of t, we have this variable where we see the different state changes. We essentially map each state change of the variable to different kind of elements of t. So we have also the different kind of elements of the finite fields mapped to the roots of unity. So just a kind of us spreading out the different kind of computations of the execution trace. And then we start with the trace polynomial, which is here. So the trace polynomial in this case represents the state changes of v over t. And this is just how we start. This is how we start with the execution trace. Just as a very basic understanding of the beginning of this. Then we start with the encoding is essentially where we just extend the domain. And you can see how we fill up this domain which we had initially, and we fill up with redundant kind of data, just to kind of like add this kind of low degree extension along the trace polynomial curve. Then we essentially start committing to the variations along these different kind of along the extended domain that we've defined before. So this is the Merkle commit, the Merkle root, and the Merkle commitment in this case. And kind of for me important was to understand that once we've constructed this Merkle tree, we essentially commit to certain values of the computation. And I think this step is quite important. So even though we don't know that this computation was done correctly, we need the prover to commit to variations so that he cannot in the end also change it. And we also can actually see by doing some variations that these that these values are actually consistent with the polynomial that was committed. So this is step 5. And now we get to the constraints, which is kind of essentially, let me zoom out. Now we get to constraints, which essentially was for me quite difficult to kind of like really kind of wrap up into a simple way of presenting. But the way I've done it here is that basically we are applying constraints over the extended domain of still this kind of like trace table, just because it's a very nice format to visualize this. In this case, it's obviously very simplified. So we have these two different constraints where we have a transition as well as a boundary constraint. Where you can see that at the in the simplified form is at each correct value, they equalize to 0. However, at the redundant data that we've added to the domain, they don't equate to 0. And I think for me, that's kind of just, that's where I kind of started. And then as we have these constraints, right, there could be way more constraints for different kind of, computations. In this case, it's just a very simplified version. Depending how complex the computation is, there might be many more. But what do we do then? We essentially take all these constraints and we compress them into one constraint polynomial, which we call the composition polynomial. This is a very basic idea of how we can actually compress them. And I've previously talked about us committing to certain data that the prover has committed to, but we actually don't know if the computation is correct. If we can prove that this composition polynomial is actually of low degree, we can actually then verify that this computation was done correctly. So these two steps are very, very important. Yeah, so then we have basically, we went through the execution trace, we went through the encoding, we applied the constraints also, and then we constructed the composition polynomial. So now we have all these constraints in this one polynomial, and we need to prove that it's of low degree to actually prove that the computation was done within the constraints, therefore it being correct. So that's where we start with Phi. I struggle a little bit how to visualize Phi a little bit, but I hope I did a good job here. So it's kind of clear. Okay, so there are different phases in Phi. They might be named sometimes very differently, but for me, my intuition is kind of like is aligned with this, where we go through a commit, split, and mix and fold process, which we repeat until we derive, in this case, a degree below 1, which means it's a constant. This also can be different, obviously, depending on the degree size. This doesn't have to be always below 1, but it's just a simplified view. And then we enter the query phase. Okay, step number 8. So here we actually initiate the Phi protocol by committing the composition polynomial. And the verifier basically responds, in this case, with a random value. And then what the prover does, he goes through splitting, a mix and fold process. I just provided the formulas here. I think a learner who actually goes through this process has to look at these formulas himself. I don't think this one page I can go through every single formula and explain all of them. But this is the basic with the splitting and the folding, just so it's verified. Also, these should all be correct. Okay, so now we're at step 8. Now we would go through this all over again, just like I kind of like visualize at the top, where we continuously lower the degree, in this case by a factor of 2, and we derive a polynomial of degree below 1, which in this case is a constant. So we provide a constant, and this is kind of concludes the commit phase. And then we haven't finished, because obviously after having committed all these different kind of informations, the verifier has to actually start with the query phase and actually start verifying everything. This is step number 10, where the verifier essentially queries in a certain amount of indices of variations at different layers of the Phi protocol, where we can then actually have, where the prover provides 2 values at each of these indices. And this is just kind of a visualization for each different round, what kind of values would have to be provided. And then we actually go for the last step, which is where the verifier can actually locally, I think locally is quite important, because it doesn't require any more information in this case, where we can now actually confirm the that the initial polynomial that we're kind of working with is of low degree, so the computation is within the constraint. We can check the consistency of the variation, so we can actually see that all these variations are part of this polynomial. And obviously we can also verify the Merkle proofs of each round. And this is just the formula to check that the variations are correct using, we can actually check the variation of one layer using the variations of the previous layer. And this then concludes Phi. And then we end up with this kind of visualization, which I think kind of turned out quite well. Again, like if there are any kind of like main issues with this, let me know, because I think I would like this obviously to be somewhat helpful to learners. So if there's certain errors, I can obviously correct them. And kind of the goal, it would be like a GIF, so it should be like animation from the beginning to end. I just made it easier for myself. Otherwise, I would have had to speak so quickly to go through each iteration. But yeah, that's basically it. I hope that was kind of helpful.